This is GARIS, Masculist, MGTOW flyers, that is 2 3-page essays on the themes of masculism and MGTOW, written by and read aloud by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. This is flyer number 427, part 2, entitled Parliamentary, Gender Equality Committees. Continuing straight on. The masculists are pushing hard to create millions of men who have had their masculist consciousnesses raised, who see the massive injustices committed by the hated fluffy feminist hypocrites and fluffy parasites against men. Such masculisted men can easily avoid and reject the fluffy manslaving parasites by refusing to marry them and from giving them their sperm. What will be much more difficult for these freshly minted young masculists will be to combat the deeply misandrous gender laws created by the monoconscious feminists in the 70s and 80s that so brutally abused men due to the monoconsciousness of the feminists of the time, who unquestioningly, unconsciously saw the role of men as cash machines to pay for women to have babies. It was men who liberated women from household drudgery by giving women, in brackets, who invent almost nothing, create almost nothing, build almost nothing, science-based medicine, so that women now have a life expectancy well into their 80s, so that even those women who stay at home to raise their 2 kids until the second one is off to kindergarten still have a career window of half a century. So the masculists are telling women that now that women can work, they must work, or be treated, that is, punished, for being hated manslavers and eventually killed if a sex war comes. Thus, millions of men are now becoming angry and increasingly hateful of fluffy feminist hypocrisy and lash out at the massive gender injustice committed against men by these monoconscious feminazi bitches, these misandrous, male-dumping, manslaving, monoconscious, hypocritical bigots who had been utterly brainwashed by 60 years of second and third wave feminism to believe that gender oppression is a one-way street, whereas in fact it is women who oppress men far worse than vice versa, since women's oppression of men is continuous and lasts decades, manslaving men for decades. To convince the average woman of this, give her the masculist chair test, which puts a feminist in a chair, with a masculist standing over her with a gun at her head, forcing her to make a choice, in brackets, at the count of 3, or he blows her brains out, between being raped or being enslaved by a man, forced to work for him with no kids and no pay for 3 decades. Most women would prefer to be raped, arguing that a woman can recover from the psychological trauma of a rape, which lasts only minutes, whereas 3 decades of slavery to a man is seen by the majority of women as a far greater gender crime than rape. The masculists then turn this argument on its head by saying that these women have agreed that women's slavery is a far greater gender crime than rape. Yet manslavery is what millions of women routinely do to men, and therefore conclude that women oppress men far worse than vice versa. With millions of very angry, hateful masculists around, the stage is now set for the next major phase in masculist political development. Already we are seeing the first signs of collective masculist rage at the massive gender injustices committed by the hated monoconscious fluffy feminist hypocrites. For example, recently, an Australian headmistress dictated to the boys of her school to give a public apology to the girls in her school for the fact that men are rapists. The boys complained to their parents that they personally were not rapists, so why did the monoconscious feminazi headmistress force them to make this public apology? Many of the parents were outraged and lashed back at the headmistress, who then backtracked strongly in order to keep her job. Otherwise she would have been booted out on her fat feminazi ass by very angry masculisted parents, especially the fathers who had already absorbed masculist and MGTOW ideas. Another example of the growing rise of angry, hateful, masculist feelings against monoconscious, fluffy feminism occurred at a school in the state of New York recently, where some 50 to 60 high school boys in 11th and 12th grades of the school met at lunchtimes to discuss MGTOW ideas: divorce, rape, rejection of marriage and paternity. The monoconscious feminazi teachers and students, female students, were outraged by what they saw as toxic males lashing out at women, utterly failing to see the source of the masculist hatred of monoconscious feminist oppression of men. Incidents like this will only increase as more millions of men have their masculist consciousnesses raised, who then become angry and hateful at the massive injustices committed against men by the hypocritical, callous feminazis who know nothing about how women oppress men, and that women oppress men far worse than vice versa. In time, millions of men will join forces and start pushing for the menfairing of the gender laws. We will see a repeat, but this time with the genders reversed, of what happened with the feminists in the 70s and 80s, as women took their feminist ideas into the parliaments and got the gender political laws changed. For example, those mentioned above. The stage will soon be set when masculists will do the same for men. That is, by setting up parliamentary gender political committees, by throwing out half of these committee members, who today are still all feminists, who suffer the delusion that gender oppression is a one-way street, who have profoundly misandrous attitudes towards men, who see men as toxic, as rapists, to be punished for being men, especially in the divorce courts which they control, and hence destroy the lives of a quarter of married fathers, which is such a major gender crime as seen by the masculists, that it's a war issue that will cause millions of men to rise up and in the limit murder thousands of monoconscious feminazi bitches for their massive gender crimes against men. Once these parliamentary gender equality committees consist of half female, half male members who devote as much time and energy to women's and men's gender political issues, then we will have genuine gender equality in the legal process. In today's world, this is far from being the case, since almost all the members of these parliamentary gender equality committee members have the unquestioned, unconscious assumption that gender equality means gender equality for women. That is, they suffer from the monoconscious bias that gender oppression is a one-way street. So it is the task of the masculists to disillusion them of this monoconscious feminazi bias by educating society that gender oppression is a two-way street. Politically minded masculists will push hard for the establishment of these parliamentary gender equality committees, where gender equality means equality for both, in capital letters, sexes, not the monoconscious bias of today's feminist definition of gender equality. Once these parliamentary gender equality committees exist in the major countries, for example Europe, US, Canada, Australia, etc., then they can start pushing for fundamental gender political restructuring of society by pushing hard on young women to fip up or rot on the shelf, by menfairing the gender laws, by boyfairing the schools, for example, by giving male primary school teachers higher salaries than women, so that more men are prepared to be primary school teachers, so that millions of young boys are not alienated by female teachers who had no male role models, and worse, are being indoctrinated by monoconscious young feministed female teachers who preach to young boys that men are toxic, men are rapists, that men are morally inferior and the like, totally alienating and making the lives of young boys miserable by this callous, vicious, monoconscious, feminazi doctrine. The major task of these parliamentary gender equality committees will be the legislation of the para, which probably will be fought tooth and nail by women who have deeply held attitudes and expectations of men that men exist to pay for women to have babies. The men, the masculists, in these committees will have to push hard for a fundamental restructuring of the gender roles in whole societies so that young women are pushed hard to fip up. For example, by making the teaching of calculus compulsory in the 11th and 12th grades, as was the case in the Soviet Union, so that women can more easily fip up by not being excluded from taking up career competent majors at college. The Soviet Union had a much higher proportion of women who were scientists and engineers than in the West when it still existed. These committees will need to preach masculinist ideas and values along with feminist ideas and in an equal proportion so that everyone in the culture or the country concerned is made to be biconscious, that is, have both their feminist and their masculist consciousnesses raised, so that everyone realizes that gender oppression is a two-way street, so that monoconscious people of either sex, especially traditional monoconscious feminazis, are seen as bigots, and in the case of feminists as MFBs, that's monoconscious feminazi bigots, who remain closed-minded after 60 years of monoconscious feminazi brainwashing. In time, the female members of these committees will see what the male masculisted members of the committees are talking about and will become themselves biconscious and come to view monoconscious feminists as bigots, as MFBs, and set out to punish them for committing the major gender crime of manslaving men. These female members will see manslavery as a moral abomination, hating it with the same level of passion as the abolitionists in the northern states of the US in the 1800s had against the Negro slavers in the southern states, an issue that lay behind the US Civil War. To masculists, fluffydom is manslavery, manslavery is slavery, and slavery is hated. To masculists, manslavery is a war issue. If women don't fip up and pull their financial weight, not parasiting off the labour and money of a man, these fluffy women will be killed in a sex war, that is, one aimed at wiping out fluffy manslaving parasites and fluffy feminist hypocrites. For masculists, the most effective way to rid the world of fluffy manslavers and fluffy feminist hypocrites is to create parliamentary gender equality committees, which then have as their tasks the menfairing of the gender laws, especially bringing in the para by socially engineering society so that everyone is taught to be biconscious, so that monoconscious feminazi bigotry is wiped out. Such committees will fundamentally change society by fundamentally changing the gender roles so that women fip up and men are freed from the massive gender affliction of being manslaves to women for decades. This will liberate men profoundly. In today's world, gender equality means equality for women, but says nothing about gender equality for men. Parliamentary gender equality committees that consist half and half of female feminists and male masculists will create true gender equality, since both feminist and masculist issues will be treated equally, and monoconscious feminazi bigots will die out, converted into being biconscious, or forced to rot on the shelf by masculisted men who won't go near them, not even pumping and dumping them, so that their monoconscious feminazi bitch genes are wiped out, removed from the gene pool, thus effectively exterminating them as monoconscious, manslaving, hypocritical, feminazi vermin. If I were a monoconscious feminist reading the above, I would become very afraid, since I would realize that when men become collectively angry and hateful at women, then God help women. Cheers. Prof. Dr. Hugo de GARIS, Email profugodigaris@yahoo.com. Website profugodigaris.wordpress.com. Author of the book Masculism, Men's Rebellion Against Being Manslaves to Women, an e-textbook of 420 plus masculist flyers for men's studies courses. Freely downloadable in Microsoft Word format from my website. Ciao.